previous years. It uses electricity. It needs you to set up and build a circuit, and it needs you to make a set of measurements. So I will be doing that as a class lab when sometime after we get back into the school. But I will be looking today, and hopefully we'll get this finished, at the applications of capacitors and some of the reasons why we use capacitors for what we do. Question that I put on the screen, a couple of you have responded. What factors determine the capacitance of a capacitor? It's where we finished yesterday. And basically what I was wanting you to put up in there is that there are a number of things that we do that will affect what happens to the flow of electrons, or the transfer of electrons, as I have described to you. First thing was, if I get my screen active, the area, the larger the surface area of the plates that make the capacitor, the greater the capacitance, the more electrons you can store inside that device. The second thing is the distance. The greater the distance between the plates means that less of or less effect will be had on each other. And it means that then it will take longer to charge the capacitor to get all of the electrons because of the difference. And thank you, the last part that I just see, the input, is of course the permittivity, or the medium through which the insulation takes place. Higher permittivity means that the electrons will have a much greater chance of improving their ability to transfer onto the other plate. So capacitance is proportional to permittivity. Now that tells us that capacitors can be defined through the combination of eta, the permittivity, the surface area, then divided by the distance. So if I took my two binliner plates that you saw yesterday in the video, no worry, Ella, you're here now. If you take the two plates as we saw yesterday, change the medium in between them and made them a bigger distance apart, we would change the capacitance. Now, why is that important? Well, I've had a number of devices for you, and I've got this little combination, which hopefully you can see in front of my face, or hold it down a little. And we've got three capacitors. We've got one just here, one just here, and one just here. And they are joined together. And that means that the capacitance of two or more capacitors joined together will change. And I think you looked last year at resistance, and you saw that if you joined resistors in series, you simply added the values of the resistance together. If you put resistors in parallel, you use that strange formula that said 1 over R1 equal plus 1 over R2 equals 1 over RT. So you should have seen that formula last year. Can you just confirm that you did see that, or that you tried it during last year? Thank you. Good. Capacitors, unfortunately, don't follow the same rules. So let's have a look, and I'll show you the reason why. And if we consider now, we're talking about capacitors in parallel. Parallel means that their two ends are joined together. So if I take this capacitor just here and I join it to this capacitor, hopefully you can see this. Let me just make sure on my other PC that you can see it. Yes, you should be able to see that. If I take these two together and join them like so, they are joined in parallel. If I take them like that, so they're daisy chained together, they're joined in series. So we're looking now at two capacitors side by side that are joined together in parallel. They're identical. Both capacitors have a 10 microfarad capacitance. So now we can look at them and we can say that something interesting has happened. Adding the second capacitor in parallel increases the surface area here because we've got this capacitor joined to this capacitor. So it's the equivalent of having one capacitor with twice the size, same separation, the plates are the same distance apart, just here, and the medium is the same between these two capacitors. So what have we done? Well, we've increased the overall capacitance. We've twice the surface area, so we've twice the capacitance. The individual values of capacitance for a certain number of parallel capacitors can be added to obtain a single value. So this, of course, is the complete opposite of resistors. Resistors in series, we added them together. Now we're seeing that with capacitors in parallel, the total capacitance is capacitance 1 plus capacitance 2 plus 3, so on, as far as however many capacitors you have. So in this example just here, a 10 microfarad together with a 10 microfarad gives us a resultant of 20 microfarads. We add those together simply in a straightforward manner. This is called the equivalent capacitance. So I have here 3 capacitors in this little array, 3 capacitors connected in parallel. So I've got one at the bottom, one in the middle, and one at the top. Each one of these is, I think, written on it is 50, yes, it's 50 microfarads. So I've got 50, 100, 150 microfarads in total. So that is a simple way of doing it. So I have now, for whatever reason, 3 different capacitors joined together. I could replace them with that one capacitor, which has 150 microfarads capacitance. And that is a reason that we can do this. We can add and subtract capacitors together. Replacing parallel capacitors in a single capacitor doesn't affect the rest of the circuit. The only thing may be that capacitors connected in parallel might be doing different jobs. And we'll talk about that when we get on to the applications in the next part. If there's any questions on that, I think this one's fairly straightforward. Let's now have a look at two capacitors again, 10 microfarads and 10 microfarads, but this time connected in series. So I've got one connected to the next one, such that the plates are now daisy chained, linked together. Adding the second capacitor in this series effectively increases the distance between the first positive plate and the back negative plate. So this time we've doubled the distance between these two when we add these two capacitors together. So this therefore decreases the capacitance. Think about it. One of the properties that affected the capacitor was the separation, the distance between them. The distance directly reduced the capacitance of this combined capacitor. And the equivalent capacitance this time is given by 1 over Ct equals 1 over C1 plus 1 over C2, and so on, to however many capacitors you have. Now, I think in the examples I'm going to show you, or questions, you will only get 2 capacitors. But it works if I had 3, 4, 5, doesn't matter. However many I join together in series, their capacitance will always decrease. So the capacitance of 2 10 microfarad capacitors in series is 5 microfarads. How do we get that? Well, 1 over Ct is 1 over 10 plus 1 over 10. 1 over 10 plus 1 over 10 is 2 over 10. 1 over Ct equals 2 over 10. Turn that the other way round. Ct is 10 over 2. So therefore, we have a simple formula again that we can apply. Now, it's not quite first thing in the morning, but you do need to get that matter in motion. So what is the equivalent capacitor for a 10 microfarad capacitor in parallel with 2 further identical capacitors? So we have now 10 microfarads in parallel with 2 other, so we've got 3 capacitors in total. What will be their equivalent capacitance? So fairly quick response from you, and I think that you'll see 30 microfarads is the correct answer. How do we get that? Well, the total value, C1 plus C2 plus C3, 10 microfarads plus 2 others, gives you the correct answer. So Ct is 30 microfarads. Great, first one done. Now, what we've got for the second one is a 5 picofarad capacitor in parallel with a 10 picofarad and 100 picofarad. So now see if you can work out the correct. These are all in parallel. So again, we're getting a fairly quick response. Be careful, somebody just wrote micro, it's picofarads. Pico F, pico F, pico F. So just be careful, the units will stay the same. The solution, yes, correct, was 115, the sum of the three. So CT is C1 plus C2 plus C3. Good. 5 plus 10 plus 100. CT, therefore, is 115 picofarads. Thank you. Now, what we've got here is the next combination is 3 1 nanofarads. Remember, nano 10 to the minus 9. So this time we've got 3 1 nanofarad capacitors connected in series. What will be the total capacitance? Be careful, write down, remember these are now in series, 1 over the capacitance, 1 over CT equals 1 over C1 plus 1 over C2 plus 1 over C3. This one, just be careful, calculation, you haven't put a unit. 1 over 3 is not a conventional way, shall we say, of writing. So let's have a look. Still 1 or 2 that have not entered anything yet, so I will be looking, please. Right, so we're getting closer now. So the solution, 0.33 nanofarads. So again, solution is calculated 1 over CT total equals 1 over C1 plus 1 over C2 plus 1 over C3. Substituting your values, 1 over 1 times 10 to the minus 9 plus 1 over 1 times 10 to the minus 9, etc. means that we then get 1 over CT equals 3 times 10 to the 9. So CT is 1/3 times 10 to the minus 9, which equals 0.33 nanofarads. So those of you that wrote 1/3, yes, correct, but you do need to write the multiplier or the order of magnitude so that we do get the correct value in there. So please bear that in mind and remember that for future reference. Okay. Now things get a little more, you need to think now. Remember, lowest common denominator when you're adding fractions together. So again, this time we've got 1, 2, and 3 nanofarads all in series, 1 over 1 nanofarad, 1 over 2, 1 over 3, etc. So you need to calculate. Thank you. Right, so we've got a good selection of answers, thank you. So this time we get, of course, the 0.55 nanofarads. How is that the case? So 1 over C1 plus 1 over C2 plus 1 over C3. Then we have, oops, substituting the values. Again, you can do this on a calculator, but of course it just looks so much easier if you write this down so you can see your values. Lowest common denominator is 6. So we get 2 over 6, 3 over 6, and 6 over 6. So adding those all together, 11 over 6, which gives us then the 6 over 11 times 10 to the minus 9. As we invert this, 0.55 nanofarads. Right, now just to make things interesting, let's throw in a curveball. And we've got now 3 capacitors of different magnitudes, the equivalent now of these 3 connected in series. Great, so we're getting 1 or 2 solutions. Well done. That's what I like to see. So if we connect the solution, straightforward again, the combination gives us each of these. So again, this time, lowest common denominator is going to be 100. So we get 100 over 100 plus 50 over 100 plus 1. So 151 over 100 inverted, 0.66. Good. So we've now got a methodology of what we need to do to combine capacitors. And we get, of course, combinations of capacitors in parallel and in series. It's a little more difficult to replace a combination of series and parallel capacitors because undoubtedly in an electrical circuit, they will be conducting different functions. And each time we do that, we change the functionality. Now, I think there's just the one more slide, which I'm not going to go through on here. But I do want us to have a look at this part of the presentation. Now, as we go through, you'll see the logical next part of this would have been discharging a capacitor. Well, it's actually a very interesting topic, but it's also a topic that requires lab equipment. So I'm not going to go through that. And as I've said to you, if we get the time during or after the Christmas break, we should get the opportunity to do that lab and for you to get some hands-on. You won't exactly be zapping each other, but we did have, I think it was 3 years ago, a very enterprising student who took an instant camera to pieces, and during the lesson used the instant camera instead of the setup that I had given. Just out of interest, he is actually now studying engineering at KTH. So what he did was probably stupid at the time, because he took about 1,000 volts charged into a camera. And I think you probably know these instant cameras. They're very simply made, and they have a battery that stores charge to give you a flash. And he put that flash into our circuit and, of course, blew the circuit completely. There was smoke in the room, the alarms went off, and as I say, he didn't fail the course. He got very close at times, but now he's studying at KTH. So there's hope for all of you. Okay, let's go on and see what we can go through today. Well, what makes capacitors useful is the fact that they store potential energy. I've explained that to you through the first part of our presentation. This energy comes from various different sources. You can store the energy from solar cells. You could store the energy from batteries. You can store the energy in different systems. And the lab that you'll do shows you that we can take a small product. So if we have a capacitor like this connected with a resistor, the resistor will allow the current to flow out. So the resistor can be used to discharge this capacitor. And by changing the value of this resistor, we can change the rate at which the capacitor discharges. So we can make it discharge very quickly, which you do, for example, when you take a flash using a camera. You don't want the flash to go over a long period. You want that energy immediately. So a capacitor is the ideal thing to use. Any of you that are interested in photography may have seen an external flash unit sometimes requires a time to charge up. You hear the buzzing as the flash charges, press the button, zap, you get the flash of light, and then the charge builds up the charge again. It's building up the charge inside a capacitor. So if the capacitor is discharged quickly through a low resistance circuit, it produces a short burst but of large current. And that's how the camera flash is powered. So you have this now battery control, charge up the flash. When you press the shutter release, the flash goes off immediately and lights up your subject, so you get a wonderful photograph. If the capacitor is discharged slowly through a high resistance, it produces a low current over a much longer period of time. And this could be useful, for example, as a temporary power supply, and would allow you to supply power to the internal memory of a device whilst its battery is disconnected. Some of you may have devices at home where you need to change the internal battery. And it sometimes says to you, please, once you've removed this battery, replace the battery within 5 minutes. The reason being, there is a capacitor which has stored the energy and is slowly discharging as it supplies the energy to the circuit. But after a period of time, the capacitor has completely discharged and it stops working. Now, geek that I am also interested in model trains. And the trains that I use on my train layout have lots of interesting controls. So I can do a lot of simulation control. And my trains are all digitally driven, which means as long as there is power supplied to the train, there's a decoder built into it. That decoder requires power. So the rails provide power to the decoder. And what happens if, for example, the train passes over a dirty piece of track? It loses contact with the wheels. The wheels transfer the power into the decoder, but every time it passes over a dirty piece of track or corrosion or whatever it may be, I would lose power. Therefore, I would lose the control. So built into the decoder is a capacitor, and it's called a stay alive capacitor. That capacitor provides power whenever the wheels, for example, lose contact with the track. So as they're traveling along in a straight line, hit a dirty piece of track, the wheels lose contact, no power goes to the decoder, you lose the sound, you lose the control, you can't do what was supposed to happen. What happens normally if you disconnect a battery? The thing resets. Well, that wouldn't be any good if you're trying to do something. So we use stay alive capacitors, just like these, connected into the motor. And they are connected over the side of the motor. So when it loses its electrical contact, the power that's inside here goes into the motor to keep it running. Now, it won't keep it running for 5 minutes, but it will keep it running for half a second, which is long enough for the train to travel over the dirt and the dirty area. Very specific use, but a type of use that maybe some of you can relate to. Can anybody suggest any other uses of capacitors? Just something that you think might be useful? Any suggestions? I did give you a suggestion yesterday, which stores a vast amount of charge and releases that instantaneously. Tesla. Not quite sure the car. Yeah, I think the car actually would use a very similar suggestion to what I've just said to you about the train. You can't actually run a car on the capacitors. Of course, they need the batteries, but you would be able to overcome any instantaneous errors. If you went over a bump and a a battery lost its connection or something happened, then they would maintain the power for a very short period of time. Outlets, phones, yes, of course, there are. Pacemaker, that's an interesting one. It's sort of getting close. I wouldn't want anything, yeah, a metal shock thing. That's the one we're going to talk about. Benjamin, yes, inside a power supply unit, we use capacitors, but we use them for something slightly different. We use them to smooth the voltage rather, because the capacitor charges up. Let's say your capacitor is able to charge to 12 volts. I apply an alternating current which goes positive, negative, and so on, and we provide 12 volts to that capacitor. It sort of keeps that voltage at a constant level, and they're what we call smoothing capacitors. Audio systems, absolutely. Yeah, all these things make sense. Glad that you've got some grasp on them. Well, the thing that I want to talk to you about is the thing that you said, the metal shock thing. Oh, where's it gone? Yes, it's called a defibrillator. And the defibrillator is a device that's used by medical personnel to transfer charge instantaneously to a person's heart. Now, what happens? A person has a heart attack, the heart stops beating. The heart, of course, is very much an electrical circuit. So if we give it a jolt of energy, hopefully we can stimulate it to start working again. So let's just have a look how these two plates can transfer energy onto a patient's heart. So the first thing we're doing on here, as you can see, is they're applying what we call a conductive gel. I mean, if you're doing this very quickly, you probably don't spend a lot of time, but you would ideally want a conductive gel to be able to hold your plate onto the person's chest. So you need a good electrical contact. So this gel here will be a very good conductor of electricity, because the electricity that gets onto this plate needs to be transferred out. So it reduces the loss in the form of heat. I mean, again, think that you might have 2, 3, 4, 5,000 volts passing through this thing. So you need something that will pass the energy through it and not burn the person's skin. So you can then take the paddles and place them onto the chest. That means that the person applying will then charge the capacitor inside the particular device, the defibrillator, and the capacitor inside the defibrillator has stored all of this energy. You then apply the energy into the person's heart or through to the heart, and this temporarily stops the heart muscles from fluttering. That means that the high voltage means that it allows the heart to reset itself. And by resetting, if we just go back here, and I'll try and pause it at the right point. You see just here in this diagram, what has happened is that the person's heart is fluttering. It's not doing a complete rhythm like this, but they are actually, I think the technical term is a fibrillation. And this takes place when your heart has had a heart attack, maybe you've had a stroke, or something has happened which has caused the heart muscles to stop beating regularly. You then stop that completely by applying a massive jolt of energy, and then hopefully the heart resets itself and starts on its regular motion. So just to finish that again. And as you can see just here, we now have the regular heart beat with hopefully at a time period which is not too quickly, but allows the heart to get back into its natural rhythm. What are the risks of holding the plates of a defibrillator whilst administering a shock? If you touch the plates, you would get the shock. But as you can see, I'll just go back again to here. As you can see, the metal plate is the part on here which delivers the charge. All of this just here will be insulating material, which keeps you as the administrator well away from that charge. It's a nasty experience. I've seen it in practice. I've never actually seen it used to defibrillate a person who has had problems. I mean, I've seen it on TV, of course, seen films of it, and I've seen this used on test, I was going to say models, but test dummies, which allows you to try out, make sure you put on the gel, for example, so your charge goes into the object, not into the surrounds, and so on. Hopefully that answers your question, Benjamin. Yes, there is always a risk. And I think that you'll tend to find the designs of defibrillators. We have one in the staff area. I think any of you that go down to the library and you look into the staff room, just through the staff doors, there is a defibrillator on the wall there. And you can see the hand, what would I call them, contacts. And you can actually see how the plastic, the insulating material, does keep the hands protected away from the conducting plates. Now, legally, we are obliged to test these devices, not on people, I hasten to add, to make sure that those things you've described, such as the shock jumping to the wrong direction, those things should not happen. And provided the device is secure, provided there's no breaks or cracks in, if there was a crack here, for example, in the plastic, then there is an opportunity for the charge to travel to the hands. Insulating gloves, yes, maybe you would have I don't think you'd have time in this type of emergency. Time is important. So it really is not something anybody would think, oh, have I got my gloves on? Have I got this? Have I got this? You'd need to do something pretty quickly. Okay. Do I want? I don't think I'll do this. Right. Now, if we talk about these types of devices, they deliver a charge over a period of time. And we have to remember that a capacitor is chargeable and stores energy. So let's take a capacitor charged up to 5 volts. It means it stores 5 joules of potential energy per coulomb of charge. So when the capacitor is discharged, its voltage starts to go downwards. But if it's only discharged by a small amount, then the energy released is 5 joules per coulomb. So for every coulomb drop, you would use 5 joules of energy. And this is very similar. And I think one of the things I've always said to you, much of physics uses graphs to represent something. And what will happen if we take a voltage and charge something up? As the voltage increases, the charge increases. So when we're doing the opposite and taking some charge out of this device, like the defibrillator, we are only taking a small part of the overall energy. And that means, yes, and that means what will happen is that we take energy and we actually do the equivalent of work. If we discharge this over a period of time, 1 step, 2 steps, 3, 4, and so on, the energy released is then capable to be summed up. We can see this as a triangular shape. Remember from previous graphs we looked at in mechanics, the total energy stored is equal to the area under the graph. So the area under the graph is base times height divided by 2. So a half, Q the charge, V the voltage. So we have a formula that we can use that tells us the relationship between charge and voltage and how much energy is stored, or the work that is done in providing, for example, energy into the defibrillator. And it's very important, the bigger the capacitor inside the defibrillator, the more charge it will hold. And the higher the voltage, the more work can be done. In other words, you transfer that energy from the defibrillator tabs to the heart. That work and that energy is what then stimulates the heart to beat again. So, final activities for today's lesson. We're almost at the end now. We have again a formula. So the energy stored is a half the charge times the voltage. So let's see how we can work on that. Calculate the energy stored in a capacitor if the charge stored is 2.5 times 10 to the minus 4 coulombs and it's charged to 15 volts. So calculate now and let's see some answers. So we're seeing one or two answers. So Rawaz, I haven't seen anything from you yet at all. So please, can I have something? And the answer, I think, as you've done, half Q times V, half the combinations, which gives us 1.9 times 10 to the minus 3 joules, or 0.0019 joules. So a good start to the questions. Second, this time calculate the charge stored. So this time, charge stored is 2 times the energy stored divided by the voltage. Energy, remember, is measured in joules, voltage in volts. So the charge now is the 2 times the energy divided by voltage. Good. We're starting to see the right. Well done. Oh, again, 2W divided by V. Three times 10 to the minus 4 coulombs. So we've got a whole series of correct answers. Well done. I'm pleased to see. So the last one, calculate this time. So we're getting quickly now. And remember the voltage this time. Great. Of course, you've got very straightforward. 2 times 6.4 divided by 3.2 gives us the correct answer of 4 volts. Good. Now, if we can see all of these alternate ways, the equation gives us the stored energy when a charge Q is stored in a capacitor at a given voltage. How can the energy stored be calculated if only the capacitance and the voltage are known? Well, what we have to consider is how we link charge, capacitance, and voltage. And if you remember the capacitor equation that we had right at the beginning says Q equals capacitance times voltage. The quantity of energy stored, the charge inside a capacitor, is its capacitance times its voltage. And we have also here the equation that tells us what happens for the equation gives the energy stored, a half Q times V. So let's substitute Q as CV. We now get then the energy stored in a capacitor when it's charged can be calculated from the capacitance and the voltage. So we now have a slightly different equation, but doing the same thing. Instead of using charge, though, which in some instances is difficult to calculate or to measure, I should say, we have in school, it's a good example, a charge meter, but it doesn't have a scale. It only registers whether a charge is present or not. There are, of course, devices, but they are very, very expensive. But we can measure relatively easily. You can take a meter and measure the capacitance, put the terminals on here, measure the capacitance. So if it's not, it's actually written on the top of it. So you can tell this is a 1 microfarad capacitor. And we can measure the voltage using a voltmeter across here. We know the capacitance and we know the voltage, we can work out the charge. So what's the equation for work in terms of C and Q? Well, we can take the alternative and instead of having charge, instead of having charge, we're putting in the quantity of charge and the capacitance with no voltage. So my final activities for today's lesson really do give us the answers to most of the questions that I would like. And I'd like you, please, not to submit here, but I would like you to submit to the classroom. And I'm sorry, but I just forgot to put up the classroom this morning. So I just go to that. I'd like you to put the answers to these, not onto the chat line, but onto the school classroom, please. And I'm just in the process of opening that. So 3C physics, and it's the activity in capacitors. So energy storage.
Where do I put the answers?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'd listed it down, but I hadn't put it in, so I'm just putting it in there. Okay. It's assigned now, so there should be in the classroom, let's just go to capacitance, energy storage, true or false. If you can just go into there, put in your solutions, so it's...
On private comments, right?
Sorry?
Should we put it on private comments?
Just a moment, just one moment, just one moment. I'm not sure if you were able to hear me. I've opened the classroom now, so you should be able to put it into the classroom. The classroom, there is an assignment called energy storage, true or false. If you can put it into there.
But how do you want us to put
just list them? So one, is it true? Capacitor stores electrical potential energy. True or false? Be in school. If any of you want any booklets, need any help, need anything during that time, as you know, there are the peer reviews on Wednesday, Thursday. I think most of mine will be done. But I'm in school there. I'm contactable via either email. My mobile phone number is available also in school. So please, any of you have questions, anything that's unclear. I've had some questions regarding booklets. I know that a couple of people would like to collect some next week. So if any of you are missing anything, any of you need any more information, please just get in contact. Aside of that, for those that I don't see, I wish you all a very, very happy Christmas. Come back refreshed, healthy, ready to work, and let's get on with the final part of this course. So thanks again for everybody. Work hard, keep busy, and maybe see you next week.
See you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks.
Thank you. Merry
Bye.
Christmas.
Thank
Merry
you.
Christmas.
Bye.
Merry Christmas. Bye bye. Goodbye. Merry Christmas.